In this lesson, we are going to learn what exactly are variables and how to use them. Right now, the text on the front end of our app is static. This means that we can change the text only by updating the text directly inside of Didify, and then by rebuilding our code to deploy our updates. To make this text dynamic, we need to understand a fundamental concept in app development, which is that of variables. Variables are really important in app development, but what exactly is a variable anyway? Well, in super simple terms, a variable is just like a box. Just like a box, you can give your variable a name to describe its contents. This will help you remember what you've stored inside of the variable. For example, let's give this variable a name, user email. After you've created the variable and named it, you can store something inside of the variable. For example, I can store a user's email address, joe@didify.com, inside of my variable. I can then label the variable with the unique name that I gave to it, like so. Now I can put the variable away with all of my other variables and forget about it. And when I need to use the contents of my variable in the future, I can then find my variable by looking up the variable's name, unpacking the contents of the variable, and then using its contents in my app development. For example, I could have a page in my app that looks something like this. To personalize this welcome message, I can reference the email address stored inside of the user email variable, like so. Now, when I run my app, this reference to the current user email address will get replaced with the contents of my user email variable, which is the email address joe@didify.com. Let's see how this looks inside of Didify. So in Didify, to see the list of your app's front-end variables, click the Variables button here. This will bring up a list of variables that were created when we first installed the Authentication app template. For example, we have one variable here labeled current user. This variable will store the email address of the current user that is logged into your application. To create a new variable, click the Add App Variable button here. Next, give your variable a name. I'm going to call mine ToDoItem. Set the type of the data that you want to store inside of the variable. For now, let's leave this set to text. Next, let's set the initial value that will be stored inside of the variable. Now, in my case, I'm going to set the initial value of my variable to do the weekly shop, which is going to be one of my to-do items. Finally, click Save. We now have created a variable called ToDoItem, and this is of type text, and this variable has this text value stored inside it, which is my to-do item, do the weekly shop. At this point, the variable has been created and we've stored an initial value inside of it, but we are not currently using the variable for any practical purposes in our app. If we actually want to use the variable, so for example, if we want to take the contents of the variable and display it on our app's front end, we will need to bind the variable to an element on the front end of our app. For example, let's take this to-do here. So this to-do is currently a static text element. However, we can bind this static text element to our variable, and then the text element will display our variable data instead of this static text. To do this, first select the text element, and then click on the cog icon here to bring up the settings box for the selected element. This first setting here tells us what text value this element is bound to. You can see here that the text element is currently bound to the static text value, which is Startup App Launch Program. You can change the static text value by changing the static text to say another to-do, such as go for a walk. However, we can also bind the text value to our ToDoItem variable. To do this, click on the T icon here. Then click on the variable option, expand this global box here, and then search for the to-do item variable. Select the to-do item variable and click OK. You will see that the text element on the screen now updates to display the name of the to-do item variable inside of these curly brackets. Let's examine this variable in a little more detail. So the variable looks like this. It is two curly brackets, and inside of the curly brackets is the variable name. This syntax is used to represent variables on the front end of your app. And when our app runs, this variable will be replaced with the initial value that is stored inside of the variable. So let's go back into Didify and do that right now. Back inside Didify, first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build my code by clicking on the Build Code button here. Now, once the code has been built, I'm going to go over to my live app and click the refresh button here. You will now see that my first to-do value here has changed to display the contents of my to-do item variable. Finally, let's try changing the initial value of the variable and see how that changes this data displayed on our front end. So to do this, go back inside of the Didify Design Studio, click the Variables button, find the to-do item variable, select the variable and change the initial value on the variable. I'm going to set my initial value to say, watch a football match. And finally, click Save. Now, rebuild the code by clicking the Build Code button here. And after the code has been built, go over to the live app and click the Refresh button here. You can now see that my to-do item variable has changed to watch a football match since I've just changed the contents of the to-do item variable inside of Didify. Pause the video now and try creating your own to-do item variable, set an initial value for the variable, and then bind the variable to another text element on your page. Rebuild your code and then preview your live app. In the next video, I will show you how to use variables to let your app's users type into this input box in order to set the text values of your to-dos in your table directly inside your live app.